Hobgoblins are pretty comfortable remaining in their forts and dealing with their own internal politics when left to their own devices. But an interesting phenomenon occurs when hobs randomly encounter other goblinoids or seek them out. It is viewed as a divine sign, a sign that Maglu has brought them together to do his will. This phenomenon is the formation of a host, and a host can only mean one thing: war. When the three goblinoids meet up and become a host, it fundamentally changes how every individual behaves in it, societally and militarily. Hobs are the backbone of a goblinoid host and tend to take up almost all of the leadership positions. They also get sort of invigorated with this fiery passion and fanaticism that gives a sense of urgency to everything that they do. When multiple legions gather into a host, each of those legions have a separate status, similar to how banners in a hobgoblin legion can have different levels of status or authority. The Legion of the Host's warlord has the highest status. Hobgoblins in a legion will set aside petty differences, and they don't typically try to depose the leader of the host unless the perfect opportunity presents itself. Interestingly, each legion will record all insults directed towards one another, and once the host disbands, those insults will be used to fuel new flames of animosity towards the other legions. In a goblinoid host, bugbears will take on roles as spies, assassins, and bodyguards. They'll only listen to senior leadership in the host rather than others of their own race. Sometimes the hobgoblins will equip them with better gear. This can take the form of metal-tipped javelins or chainmail shirts. They refuse long-range weapons, so they're never given it, and tend to avoid heavy armor because it compromises their stealth capabilities. If some bugbears seem particularly suited to an aspect of war, then the hobs may specialize them even further to make the best use of their abilities. These bugbear specialists are separated into one of three categories. We have 1. Thugs, bugbears that aren't very suited for stealth, that leap into groups of foes and make wide sweeping attacks to create gaps in enemy formations. 2. Bulwarks, these bugbears charge into battle with a spiked shield, turning themselves into a living battering ram. They steamroll or push aside anything in their paths. And finally, we have number 3, murderers. The opposite of thugs, these bugbears are gifted in stealth and are sent out to kill enemy sentries in order to penetrate enemy defenses. They carry a lot of javelins with them, which they can throw from hiding or use in melee. They also carry garrotes to quickly cut off any sounds of screaming during their covert missions. When goblins join the host, hobs quickly begin to train the pariahs and gatherers in the ways of soldiering. This essentially moves all these goblins up the caste system and dissolves certain categories out of the goblin caste system entirely. Since they're all baseline hunters, any goblin, no matter how high in status they may typically be, are subject to follow any order given by a bugbear or hobgoblin. So even a goblin chief is at the beck and call of the lowest ranking bugbear, but oftentimes the higher ranking goblins will just push those orders onto the lower ranking ones. Should the need arise, goblins will work as scouts, sappers, and skirmishers. Speaking of auxiliary units, hosts consist of more things than just goblinoids, especially if they've been on the warpath for a bit. Wolf and warg mounts are a guarantee, as well as flocks of ravens, but it isn't uncommon for a host to transport cockatrices, slave fighters, or even a hydra that goblins are forced to ride once they manage to cover each of the creature's eyes. Host on the march. Goblinoid hosts don't stay idle. They march in pursuit of war and glory for Maglu. Sometimes they'll break off small garrisons of one type of goblinoid to guard already conquered territory. Hosts usually march at night. Riders carrying messenger ravens will travel on all of the host's flanks and report as needed. Most of the army travels on foot, but it isn't uncommon for goblins to ride on wolves and wargs, or for hobs to ride on horses or any other mount that they can get their hands on. And while bugbears may not ride mounts, they're more than willing to hitch a ride on a battle beast. If a host has slaves, then those slaves will pull the equipment of war in the center of the host. Think catapults, trebuchets, ballistas, and anything else along that vein. War conducted by a host isn't raiding or pointless slaughtering, it's the sophisticated and systematic capture of land and subjugation of people. Those that surrender with little to no resistance, or those that pay proper tribute, can expect fair and honest treatment, at least by goblinoid standards. Should you decide to put up the good fight and lose, you can expect to be outright slaughtered or enslaved. Ideally, in the host's point of view, they show up, you submit, pay a tribute, then start producing resources for the benefit of the host. Once you get conquered and become a slave state, vassal state, there are some things that you can expect. The hobs bring in their own legal code, which you must adhere to, but they'll also respect your laws and customs as a way to pacify their new vassals. Some surviving leadership will be allowed to keep their position and may even find themselves having more power than they did before. As far as religion is concerned, they're less flexible there, and any spiritual leaders that offer any resistance can expect an immediate purging. Servants of harmless deities like the deity of harvest or fertility can escape this purge. If you happen to be a priest or servant to a god of battle or conquest, you'll be offered two choices: submit and worship Maglu, or purge. The actual death of loyal servants to enemy war gods is a bit of a spectacle. They face foe after foe in succession until they get exhausted and eventually die. This is two purposes: to show others the futility of their faith and resistance, and to entertain the host with some good old-fashioned fighting. Think Roman Colosseum, fight to the death, and, make everyone else happy. You can expect your temples and holy artifacts to be torn down, broken, desecrated, or repurposed. That altar that your clergyman used to preach from? More like the chopping block where Maglu's bloody axe is used to separate your heretical head from your shoulders. The war camp. Goblinoid armies don't always stay on the move. Sometimes they settle down in a more permanent fashion. These war camps aren't where you go to have Mai Tais on the lazy river, though. They're places that are ready for war 24/7. These camps can be permanent settlements. The layouts for a war camp are relatively simple, yet functional. They're circular in nature, with large pathways originating from the center and exiting the camp in the cardinal directions. So, circular design, a command center in the middle with 4 roads leading out. Large ditches are dug around the outskirts of the selected location. In the interior, you can expect to see wooden palisades, guard towers, and gates that somewhat restrict entrance via the 4 pathways. Everything is lightly guarded and patrolled if it has any sentries at all. War camps don't really care if they get taken by surprise because they're in a constant state of readiness. All the things they build in the camp are meant to act as delays rather than being true preventative measures. Inside the camp, the 3 races tend to section themselves off when picking places to sleep. Goblins are forced to build up their residences near the animal and slave pits. The bugbear dens are practically randomly scattered all around the camp, and hobs tend to stay in barracks. The main structures you'll find in a well-established war camp are the following. 1. The command center. Pretty straightforward, this is where all the decisions are made. 2. A library. Here is where all the documents go to live. Any piece of knowledge can be found here, such as maps and battle reports. This is also the main hub for communicating and strategizing. 3. The pens and pits, where slaves and animals will be kept and trained. 4. The rookery, which is a huge tree-like structure made of metal and wood. This is where all of the ravens are kept. 5. Supply wagons, also pretty straightforward. Massive supply wagons that are scattered around the camp as needed and have a minimum of 2 guards per wagon. 6. The block. This important structure is the ritualistic altar that will serve as the chopping block for enemies of the camp. If a camp doesn't have some of these structures, then those duties will be taken on by the command center. That means that if there isn't a rookery, then the command center will also act as a de facto rookery on top of its other duties. Now, if a goblinoid host seems to just keep racking up win after win in combat, then it has the potential to turn into its own legitimate nation that can last for generations. Over time, once the host runs out of challenges to conquer, it will begin to succumb to infighting. The hobs will start fighting with one another. The goblins will shirk their duties since the hobs are too distracted to oversee them. And the bugbears may just take a few heads from their former leadership before abandoning the host completely. This is the natural conclusion of a goblinoid host, and it's instinctively understood that when this occurs, it has occurred because Maglu's gaze and favor has left them. Examples of use. A goblinoid host can be a great thing to introduce into your D&D campaign. It can be something that easily fits into the first and second tiers of play. That is to say that it's something worth considering for your players that are any level between 1 through 10. Off the top of my head, for the first tier of play, it could be interesting if that's how your campaign starts. Maybe your players are all fighters or slaves that come from previously conquered villages, cities, and tribes. Kind of similar to how ancient Romans would take on warriors from lands that they'd conquered previously and turn them into gladiators or soldiers. Your early campaign could be completely centered around your players having to survive in goblinoid society and politics while also being forced to fight, kill, and conquer people that you may not want to. For the second tier of play, levels 5 through 10, maybe your players have to deal with an approaching goblinoid host. Villages that sit on the outskirts of a territory's borders disappear or are razed to the ground. Scouts stationed on the borders return to the city, out of breath from riding all night, only to tell the leader of the region that the loud thump of a goblinoid host on the march can be heard in the distance making its way to the capital. It may seem trivial since bugbear chiefs and hobgoblin captains have a challenge rating of 3, but if you as the DM are playing these enemies the way you should be, a host can be considered an act of God. It makes sense since hosts only occur due to an evil war god's will. You have to consider that there are going to be dozens of goblinoids of each type in the host, so potentially something like over 100 enemies. For your level 10, maybe this isn't an issue that a few fireballs couldn't solve, but for your level 5, this thing is akin to the big bad. You can also spice this up for PCs that are on the higher end of second tier play, so your level 8s, 9s, and 10s by tampering with stat blocks, introducing some of the goblinoid variants that I haven't mentioned in this series yet, or bringing in an avatar or small manifestation of Maglubiet himself. That's just some of the things you can do with this concept of a goblinoid host. I hope you enjoyed these last few goblinoid specific episodes of the show, and hopefully it may have sparked some ideas in your head on how you can spice up these lower level encounters with some of D&D's oldest and classic monsters. See you next week, where I'll be starting my new upload schedule. You can expect me to dominate the start of your week with new episodes, being Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday around 5 a.m. I'm still tinkering with it. I'll check out the analytics, but I think that that's what I'm going to go with for now. Anyways, if you want me to dive even deeper when it comes to goblinoids, send me an email. If you're a fellow content creator and want to collaborate, same email. It's in the description of this podcast episode. See you next time.